BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery, and in this episode I will be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect, Robert Donston Stephenson. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And Robert Donston Stephenson is a suspect that is featured on most Jack the Ripper suspect lists, but he's one that I haven't talked about on Ripper Wednesday before, and as we are going to see, there are a couple of reasons why, but I thought it was only appropriate if I made an individual suspect episode about him. And as I've said on some previous Ripper Wednesdays, I'm trying to make these episodes more dynamic and include a Q&A session at the end, as well as talking about other Jack the Ripper related materials, so please stick around until the end of this episode, and I will respond to the questions and comments from last week's episode, which was on the Goulston Street Graffito. And to provide the most basic introduction to Robert Donston Stephenson's life, we're going to go over to casebook.org because I have found that almost every forum discussion or just every YouTube video that has been made about him is really relying on casebook.org and the information that has been put out there to lay the framework out for Robert Donston Stephenson as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Robert Donston Stephenson was born on April 20th, 1841 at 35 Charles Street, and he was the son of a seed crusher named Robert Stephenson. He was well-traveled and educated and studied medicine in Paris and chemistry in Munich under Dr. James Allen. In 1859, while in Paris, he met Lord Edward Bulwer Lytton and was initiated into the Hermetic Lodge of Alexandria. There is some evidence to show that he served as a field surgeon from 1860 in Garibaldi's Army of Red Shirts in their fight for Italian unification, and claimed to have performed appendectomies. Stevenson throughout his life was fascinated by the occult and traveled to Africa to study black magic and witchcraft. One of the many unsubstantiated tales by Stevenson is of his early life, and while in Africa he claimed to have murdered a female witch doctor and killed the seducer of his favorite cousin, dipping the girl's handkerchief in the man's blood. Also, that he was a party to the murder of a Chinaman during the Californian Gold Rush, and that's just the way that it's written out there over on casebook.org. And if anybody would like to do some further listening on Robert Donston Stephenson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, there is an episode of the Ripper Cast that was uploaded just 2 weeks ago. I had been planning this episode for a while, but I saw that just 2 weeks ago, episode 1 of the Ripper Cast was uploaded to YouTube. And it's an older podcast that came out in 2008, and it's still done in the very, very bare-bones style of the podcast tradition. It seemed like there was a lot of commotion going on during the episode, but it's 1 hour and 22 minutes long, and it's just filled with information about Robert Donston Stephenson's life. And it was they had 2 guests on the program. One of them was Howard Brown, the proprietor of JTR Forums, JackTheRipperForums.com, and another researcher named Mike Koval, who both shared just a lot of info about this, and I'm going to be relying on several different sources throughout the duration of this episode. Okay, though, so if you're going to just Google Robert Donston Stephenson, yes, of course, you're going to find casebook.org. Most Jack the Ripper related things will bring you to casebook.org, but there's going to be a very simple description of Robert Donston Stephenson's life that is going to be laid out, and that is that he was fascinated by the occult. He was dealing with lots of health issues in 1888. He was somebody who may have been experimenting with black magic, and this is the way that they lay out the theory. Robert Donston Stephenson was committing the murders in Whitechapel in 1888 as part of a twisted and demented black magic ritual. And one of the things that is discussed very early on in his investigation actually comes to us from Ivor Edwards, who is the author of the book Jack the Ripper's Black Magic Rituals. And no matter what, even before we get to the black magic parts, he proposes something that is worthy of consideration all the same. He made an observation about the crimes that were committed by Jack the Ripper. The first four victims of Jack the Ripper were Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. And he points out that all of these crimes happen with a distance of between 930 and 950 meters apart. And it's almost as if this is a very, very, very specific amount of distance that is placed in between the victims, almost as if there has been this deliberate attempt to choose the victims based on their locations. Not simply because they were women in vulnerable places, not simply because they were people who just happened to be walking down the street, wrong place at the wrong time. No, according to this type of theory, this is the whole concept of placing points on a map. And what would be the point of this with four different murders happening with these very specific intervals? To create a cross. And of course, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, according to this theory involving Robert Donston Stephenson, was that Mary Kelly was murdered at a different location outside of this 930, 950 meter, let's just call it quadrangle, because she would be the extending line of the cross. And this is something that you're going to see time and time again. And I guess I'll provide some skeptical things later on, because I do want to lay out the theory. And the other issue is that this set of claims continues in the book Jack the Ripper's Black Magic Rituals, and I would just like to read a portion of the introduction. It had never occurred to me that these events might be occult in nature. Ivor, the author of this book, referred to the publisher's website, which briefly described his work and its relationship to sacred geometry. He wrote in response to seeing a website which relates to sacred geometry in the human form. This work grew out of an analysis on the Vesia Pisces, an ancient geometric symbol which has been born to express both natural principles and notions of Christian theology, and it might even be a reference to the bubble universe. So there's going to be some very, very intense stuff, and it goes so far beyond just trying to put a cross on the map, because, as I said, other people have talked about this. If you look at the cover of the book Jack the Ripper's Black Magic Rituals, you will see a five-pointed star, and that is the one that I first learned about, even before I was doing the Ripper Wednesday segment, this claim that some people think that Jack the Ripper was trying to make a pentagram on Whitechapel or in England, just a pentagram with the murders. And okay, there's another one that's been proposed by Robert Graysmith, author of the book The Bell Tower, that Jack the Ripper was trying to make a patriarchal cross by committing these 5 murders. So you see some similar things, and now not only do we have the cross, but we also have the black magic angle, the sacred geometry angle, and it seems like some very, very deep and intricate stuff that has been proposed by Ivor Edwards. But my biggest challenge to this pentagram angle, even though that's not the focus of the Black Magic Rituals one, is, okay, you have 5 murders, right? Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. You can take any set of 5 points on a city and make a 5-pointed star, depending on how sloppy you want to make the 5-pointed star. I mean, you have 5 points, 5 locations, 5 individual areas. You can make a 5-pointed star, so I'm not convinced at all that Jack the Ripper was actually trying to do that. And Robert Graysmith received an enormous amount of criticism for claiming that Jack the Ripper was trying to make the patriarchal cross. He was also using unconfirmed crimes. He was also messing up the locations. And I have a whole episode about his book, The Bell Tower, here on Black Box Online Radio, which I invite you guys to listen to. But let's look at some of these other reasons why people might think that Robert Donston Stephenson was Jack the Ripper. As I said, he was in failing health, and this is the narrative as it was believed for a very long time. He was somebody who was on the verge of actually going into the hospital for an extended stay of hospitalization, and after the murder of Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper's final confirmed victim, then he went into the hospital, and then as soon as he's hospitalized, the murders ceased. So does that not suggest that he could have been Jack the Ripper? Well, those of you who are very familiar with the story of Jack the Ripper will know that all of this stuff is absolutely incorrect. And this is the way that it was laid out on not only the Ripper file, but even on casebook.org. And again, without too much investigation, you can find that there are 3 books that were written by an individual named Melvin Harris. Jack the Ripper, The Bloody Truth, which came out in 1987, and then there was The Ripper File, which came out in 1989, and The True Face of Jack the Ripper, which came out in 1994. When the book The Ripper File came out in 1989, Melvin Harris did not have access to all of the files that were detailing information about Robert Donston Stephenson, so he believed at the time that Robert Donston Stephenson was hospitalized after the murder of Mary Kelly on November 9th of 1888. At some point in November, he goes into a hospital for an extended stay, but at the time, in between 1989 and 1994, he did get access to the medical records and the files, and it turns out that Robert Donston Stephenson was institutionalized, hospitalized, committed in July of 1888, months before the Autumn of Terror in Whitechapel even began. So, with his book, The True Face of Jack the Ripper, which came out in 1994, he had to alter his theory and state that, oh, well, he was most likely faking an illness for an extended period of time, and he had an accomplice that could get him in and out of the hospital. And the researcher that I mentioned at the beginning, Mike Koval, was someone who was actually able to obtain the medical records, and he said that for a long time, he thought Robert Donston Stephenson was Jack the Ripper. Robert Donston Stephenson was his suspect. But when he actually saw the medical records with his own eyes, seeing that, okay, he was hospitalized in July, not November of 1888, and that he was not allowed to leave the premises. I mean, this is something that I even wondered about. If someone has been institutionalized or hospitalized or committed, or they're just on an extended hospital stay, I mean, let's be very clear, no matter what issue we're dealing with, then would they just be allowed to leave the hospital? And according to his research, no, that hospital did not permit any patient to leave the grounds. So that means most likely he has a solid alibi for all of the crimes, and then you just have to start making these assumptions. Oh, well, an accomplice was helping him out, and or even the bigger one that I've already stated, that, oh, he was faking the illness for a period of time. So this theory starts to fall apart once it's been closely examined. But that's the whole point. It's about getting to the truth. And in all honesty, this episode should be called Jack the Ripper, the Story of Robert Donston Stephenson, because yesterday on Black Box Online Radio, I released an episode called Jean Benet, the story of suspect John Mark Carr, where he was a highly entertained suspect for a while in that case, but then has been mostly debunked. And I think that Robert Donston Stephenson has also mostly been debunked. And they, since the discovery that he was most likely not Jack the Ripper took place, these two individuals that were on the Ripper cast, Mike Koval and Howard Brown, just began looking for more and more aspects of his life that don't appear to be completely true, such as murdering a witch doctor in Africa. The part of Africa that he claimed he murdered the witch doctor in was Cameroon, but it was years before the English even went to Cameroon, and apparently the first Englishman to set foot in that part of Cameroon was in 1875, and he claimed that the murder happened before that. And also, this is one of the most interesting parts, they talked about how he may not have even been a black magic practitioner. And what they say about Robert Donston Stephenson is, and actually I'm just going to give my own take on the subject because I think that I can connect a few dots. Some might call him a con man, but I wouldn't call him a con man. I would call him just a very casual researcher, someone who explored different subjects, who was writing about different subjects, and he's going to be talking about black magic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he wholeheartedly believes in black magic. He's someone who had some medical education, but it doesn't even appear that he was an actual medical doctor in England. Of course, some people believe that Jack the Ripper had to have had anatomical knowledge to commit the crimes, such as pulling out the organs, very specific organs from the victims nonetheless. I mean, yes, anatomical knowledge, that would be suitable, but there's even just this belief that he was a doctor, which also doesn't seem to be completely true. Instead, I do remember reading this detail about him, that he was referred to as an informal or not just an informal or incomplete medical doctor. He's not someone who was a full-fledged professional MD, the way that we would think of one. So ultimately, I think that Robert Donston Stephenson has mostly been debunked. But I told you guys that I would get to your questions and comments about the Jack the Ripper case and from the previous episodes. And before we continue, I would like to remind you guys that anybody can support this channel at buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Yes, if you want to support any of these efforts, you can use that page. There's a link that's posted in the description box, and I do a show about the Zodiac Killer every Monday, as well as one about D.B. Cooper every Friday, and starting next week there will be a return of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning, which is going to be a general true crime discussion. It's mostly going to focus on criminology, forensics, and criminal psychology, so people can ask any question they want in the live chat, and they will be incorporated into just a very, very big true crime discussion. And you can also use the super chats during the live streams and the super thanks for any episode here on Black Box Online Radio. And to look at the comments that you guys have left, I will discuss last week's episode on the Goulston Street Graffito, but first, I would like to look at this one that was left by Foolish Mortal on the episode that I did last year about the murder of Emily Horsnell, and I was relying on a very particular Jack the Ripper source, and that was Ripper Confidential by Tom Westcott. And Tom Westcott does have a fascinating Jack the Ripper theory about how Jack the Ripper may have been a member of a London street gang, and first he starts out by committing murders of women with the gang, and then branches out on his own and goes on to commit the Whitechapel murders, for lack of a better term. Or let's just say that. I mean, that's the honest theory. He goes on to commit the Whitechapel murders. And somebody left a comment here that says, there's an old detective saying that you're supposed to go off of something like, there's no such thing as a coincidence in a murder investigation. You can't take that kind of chance. And that is the main thought behind it. That's what the author is doing. When you shut down the most credible theory and say, nobody can know for sure, you're just muddying the waters. In my opinion, all those women who were attacked were living in 2 houses, and that is extremely suspicious. And to provide an interjection, this is referring to an observation that was made by Tom Westcott about how all of Jack the Ripper's victims were staying on George Street in London, specifically the lodging houses at 18 George Street and 19 George Street. It honestly sounds like a hunting selecting ground for the killer, like Roaring Third from Kingsbury Run. You can say, I'm not surprised those people are the intended targets, and still say it's an important clue. Now that's a lead worth following. Even if it doesn't catch the killer, it helps us paint a more understanding picture of what those poor women were going through. Well, I don't necessarily dispute that, but, I mean, in fact, I do have a couple disputes, though. Maybe I do dispute that. For starters, I think Jack the Ripper's hunting ground was Whitechapel, and what I said in that episode is I wasn't overly impressed by this type of connection that could be made about how Jack the Ripper's victims all were in and out of the 18 and 19 George Street guest houses. I don't know why it's always so hard for me to say that, but I'm not impressed by that because, think of it this way. Let's use a different example. If you had 3 women who were murdered in the United States of America, where I'm from, and you find out that at different times in their lives, they had all stayed at the same homeless shelter, not at the same time, but just at different times, and you would be like, oh, well, that's what the killer's doing. He's preying on the victims from that homeless shelter. And I would just say, wait a second, how do you know that? Just because these women stayed for a very short time at the 18 George Street guest house and 19 George Street guest house, I said it right that time, it doesn't mean that that's how the Ripper was choosing the victims, that has any relevance to the case at all. That is just some type of possibility. And as previously stated, I mean, I think that there are other reasons why the Ripper could have been choosing the victims, and simpler reasons about why the Ripper could have been choosing the victims. So if I'm muddying the waters by being skeptical of that, or it goes into the well, forgive me if I am muddying the waters, but it goes into the category of just because you have this information, it doesn't mean that the connections between point A and point B are going to be valuable. I don't dispute any of this stuff that's put forward by Tom Westcott, but how does it actually bring us to Jack the Ripper? And another example would be, are you trying to say that the women had some type of connection among each other? I don't think that that would be proven. Are you trying to say that Jack the Ripper was stalking these 2 specific guest houses for female victims and remembered them months later? Well, I don't think we have enough evidence to say that. If anything, I think that it just shows that 4 of the victims were out late at night in vulnerable places. I don't think they were actually trying to create some type of sacred geometry cross or a patriarchal cross or a pentagram on London. And I think Jack the Ripper murdered women because they were in vulnerable places on the streets. And these people had to go to lodging houses. They had to pay the DOS money. And they're in and out of various buildings throughout England. So just because they all ended up staying at these two guest houses that were very close to each other doesn't mean anything to me, really. So maybe I do dispute quite a lot with this. I don't dispute the facts. Instead, I dispute the reasons why people think that these facts are going to guide us to Jack the Ripper. And one final note about that, I do have to give credit to Howard Brown for making another observation about the pentagram and the sacred geometry cross, as well as the patriarchal cross, even though that one wasn't discussed in the episode. He's like, all right, if you're going to say that you can take 4 murders, 4 locations, and turn that into a cross, or turn it into some type of other geometric symbol, you could choose the parallelogram. You can turn 4 locations into a parallelogram if you try really hard. If you were to use the murder of Mary Kelly as well, you can turn those 4 locations and 5 locations into a pentagon if you try hard enough. Again, 5 sides to the shape, 5 murders. You can make a pentagon if you truly tried. So, again, people are making these types of theories, and they aren't necessarily demonstrating how and why they are able to use all of the connecting points in a practical manner. This is one of the reasons why people get very frustrated in the true crime world. Sometimes people use real facts, but then they just start going off in a direction that is filled with conjecture and speculation. And as we're going to see with the story of Robert Donston Stephenson, sometimes it goes well beyond conjecture and speculation. Sometimes it goes to the point of just wild storytelling, fictitious additives, things that are thrown in there that aren't even true. It's not even that someone is just, hey, I have an idea about something. It's that someone's claim is just blatantly false. And now I would like to move on to the next comment, which actually came in from last week's episode on the Goulston Street graffito. After the murder of Catherine Meadows, a message was found on a building that said, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," or maybe it had a different phrasing of the words. And I noticed that you guys in the comment section had a very big divide on whether or not you thought that was from the Ripper, as well as what you thought the meaning was. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. I think that there are 3 main possibilities. Number 1, Jack the Ripper wrote it, and he was Jewish, and he was saying that the Jews have been aggrieved. Number 2, Jack the Ripper wrote it, and he was saying that he is not Jewish, and he does not like Jewish people. And number 3, it is completely unrelated. Whoever wrote it for whatever reason, well, I mean, that was their reason. It's not connected to Jack the Ripper. 3 possibilities. And 42 Lehman has one here when he says, "Personally, I would think that the judgment was made to erase it, probably because they had good intel that it was there before the crime, which has been lost to time. It is a red herring. As far as suspects, the best in my opinion are Jacob Levy, Nathan Kaminsky, who is also known as David Cohen, George Hutchinson as well. Hutchinson would be dismissed if you believe the Jewish witness story of not wanting to ID the Jewish killer. However, that witness is never named, and if it was Deemschutz witnessing something with Liz Stride, I would argue that he didn't see the Ripper because the Ripper didn't kill Stride, which makes Hutchinson a valid suspect again. Hutchinson knew at least 1 victim, probably 2 of them, and lived in the area and was ID'd by a witness as being outside of Mary Kelly's room right before the murder, only came forward after this was made public and inserted himself into the investigation and then disappeared completely." Okay, though, so we have so many things to go over there. And firstly, as you can see, the 3rd victim of Jack the Ripper was Liz Stride, and it appears that Lehman does not believe that she was actually murdered by Jack the Ripper. And again, I'm piecing this stuff together from just you guys in the comment section, so if you have anything to say at all about Jack the Ripper, please put your ideas down below, and maybe they'll be worked into a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. And this thing is that after Liz Stride is murdered, somebody shouts Lipski. There are multiple people on the street. We have Louis Deemschutz coming with his horse and cart. We have the people inside the International Men's Working Club. Excuse me for butchering that title as well. Israel Schwartz is out there. There's the Pipe Man. And what some people think is that Jack the Ripper heard the word Lipski being shouted. And Lipski was an anti-Jewish slur at the time, referring to the murderer Israel Lipski. But If the Ripper heard that and he was not Jewish, if he were not Jewish and he heard that, he's like, oh, wait, maybe somebody saw me and thought that I was Jewish or that I had a Jewish appearance. So, after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper wrote the Goulston Street Graffito and then states that, okay, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, then that is an intentional red herring that was planted as a way to deceive people. And I'm adding Lehman's comment with another comment that came in from you guys, putting that theory together. Now, what do you make of that? Where the Ripper's like, oh, I have an idea on how I can avoid getting caught. I'm going to try and blame this all on some type of imaginary Jewish person. That's one theory. Now, the exact theory that Lehman was putting forward is that Liz Stride was not murdered by Jack the Ripper. Liz Stride was just an unrelated murder, and that the Goulston Street Graffito was erased by Sir Charles Warren, and maybe the evidence of that has been lost to time. Let's not kid ourselves. There have been historical myths. There have been beliefs that we've had about historical cases that turn out to be untrue. And what Lehman is saying is that these people probably knew what they were doing. This whole concept of Sir Charles Warren wanted the Goulston Street Graffito erased because he didn't want an anti-Jewish riot to take place. Maybe all of that's true. But maybe they had actually determined that it was written on the building before. No, this isn't really a clue that was written by the Ripper. That means that the Stride murder was not connected, in Lehman's theory, and the Goulston Street Graffito is also not connected. And it could be purely a coincidence that Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered on the same night. So, which one do you agree with more? Do you think that this is the Jewish Ripper, or do you think that this is just an unrelated issue? That this might not even be saying that Jack the Ripper was Jewish at all. And as far as these observations about George Hutchinson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, I think everything that Lehman said is spot on. I mean, I went from just thinking that George Hutchinson was just, like a borderline low-level suspect. I always said he's in the middle of the deck, but I wasn't extremely impressed about anything related to him being Jack the Ripper, and now he just goes up, up, up in my book the more I learn about the Ripper case because of all of these suspicious reasons. Let me read this comment again about George Hutchinson being Jack the Ripper. Hutchinson is a valid suspect again. Hutchinson knew at least one of the victims, that was Mary Kelly, probably two of them, and lived in the area. He was ID'd by a witness being outside of Mary Kelly's room right before the murder, and only came forward after this was made public and inserted himself into the investigation. And as I've said many times before, George Hutchinson is one of the few people who's at the crime scene who does not belong at the crime scene. So thank you to Lehman for that, as well as thank you to everyone else who has also left those fragments behind of different comments. But I would love to know what you guys think about the Goulston Street Graffito, and which one do you agree with? Do you think it was written by a Jewish person, or do you think that it was written by somebody else? Now, we have a comment here from Baz Tina, who was responding to something that I said about how I thought the Ripper cut himself during the murder of Catherine Eddowes, and that's the reason why there's a 5-week gap from the murder of Catherine Eddowes to the murder of Mary Kelly. Baz Tina says, as you say, a cut on his leg is a possible reason for using a torn cloth, and the Ripper tore off a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. Plus you mentioned Chaim Hyams, and he had a noticeable limp. I mean, Chaim Hyams might very well have been Jack the Ripper as well. We're going to be talking about a lot of the mid-level suspects today, but Chaim Hyams has not shown me anything. Yeah, the real Chaim Hyams has not shown me anything. No, I mean, as a suspect, I haven't seen anything that would push him up into the upper deck for me, the upper echelon of suspects, but I am very, very curious about this. Caxon Loper says, I can see a connection between the killer shouting Lipsky, a Jewish man that was blamed for, and the graffiti. Oh, now this is even more technical, because this is somebody who is saying that Jack the Ripper may have been the person who shouted Lipsky himself, trying to just throw the blame off on the Jews intentionally, all from the start. And, that's some really, really intense stuff. And we have a comment here from James Corlett who says, hello, Ed. Firstly, I am Ned, Black Box Ned, but it says, hello, Ed. I'm just going to change that anyway. Hello, Ned. My take on the writing is that the killer was a Jew who had been seen by a fellow Jew at some point, and those who saw him enough had the possible ability to identify him or them at least, and knew that he was Jewish and being warned to say nothing, as untold violence would follow, which is why the writing was taken down allegedly. Okay, so we have many different responses to the Goulston Street Graffito, and that was from James Corlett. Thank you so much for that. Please let me know what you think about the Goulston Street Graffito. And I have to give a shout out to Dave Smith, who left a comment on a previous Ripper Wednesday episode when I was discussing the book I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter. And this is a novel. It's an attempt to tell the first-person narrative of what Jack the Ripper was thinking when he committed the crimes. I, Ripper, it's from Jack the Ripper's point of view. The Ripper is telling the reader, I did this, and then I did that. And what Dave Smith said was that he thought that it was way too fictitious, or it's too much of a novel and too much of a story that isn't connected to the real Ripper case for him to hear about. Paraphrasing, but that's the comment that was left. And once I got to the section about the Goulston Street Graffito and I, Ripper, I finally experienced that. I finally had that moment when I'm like, this is too much of a fictitious story for me to deal with, because it has Jack the Ripper committing the murder of Catherine Eddowes, and then this is telling the story of a very calculating Ripper who is doing everything by design. And he is someone who is walking toward the building on Goulston Street, and the Ripper reaches into his pocket and picks up a piece of chalk, which he brought for a very specific reason, and he's about to write the message, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. This stuff's all fine, by the way, and he practiced this sentence, the same way that a poet writes his own words, or the same way that an actor rehearses lines and goes over it over and over again. He's like, I gotta write the perfect sentence that is going to continue this narrative of Jack the Ripper, because the book I, Ripper is telling this whole story about how these crimes are committed to terrify the general public, and also to get Jack the Ripper mentioned in the newspapers, and just create this explosion of Jack the Ripper related terrorism and mania throughout the streets of London. But before Jack the Ripper is able to pull the chalk out of his pocket, a little girl comes up to him and says, Hey, mister, would you like to buy a flower? I need a penny. And he's like, What? Oh, no, a witness. He's like, No, I don't want to buy your flower. And she's like, I have nowhere to sleep. So then Jack the Ripper takes this little girl and starts walking down the street with her. And he sees a woman and he says, Hey, can you find a bed for this little girl? And she says, No, I can't. I don't have any money. And he's like, I'll give you the money if you promise to take the little girl. Don't spend it on gin. I think you've probably had enough gin already. I'll give you the money, just find a place for her to sleep. And he does. Then the Ripper goes back and writes the calculated message. And I finally reached the point, though, when I was like, okay, I'm really loving the book I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter, but that is just too much of wild storytelling for me. Because is that what really happened? I mean, Jack the Ripper was interrupted by a little girl selling flowers and, like, please, mister, I have nowhere to sleep. And all that, and it's absolutely not presented as he's doing that in an empathetic way. That's purely just to avoid getting caught or to avoid any particular distractions, but I don't think that that's what happened in the historical sense. The next part, though, of I, Ripper, is something that is defendable, something that we can actually discuss, because that's what I love about these Jack the Ripper novels. They have ideas that are genuinely relevant to the true crime world, and that is, before the Goulston Street Graffito was erased, a member of law enforcement makes the observation that people are wondering, what does this mean? The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing? Well, firstly, is it saying that the Jews are good people or the Jews are bad people? And this person points out that the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing has a double negative in it. So the correct interpretation would be the Jews are to be blamed for something. The Jews are the men that will be blamed for something. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, great point. And then they're alluding to the fact that this person is trying to say that they are Jewish and that they will be, that this is a grievement against the Jewish people. And I'm like, whoa. I completely understand this part about how there's the double negative in there, and yes, it's been discussed by other people, but just because there's this double negative, and it actually means in the English language, the Jews are the men that will be blamed for something, That just brings us back to square one. That adds zero clarity to the Goulston Street Graffito situation because that still doesn't show whether it's anti-Jewish or pro-Jewish. And one of the people who actually said that they thought that the double negative was important was that lady last year who was claiming that Edgar Degas, the painter, was Jack the Ripper. And she said she thought that a Frenchman wrote the Goulston Street Graffito, someone from France like Edgar Degas, because it has the double negative. Like in French, you would say je ne sais pas. You use the double negative twice. And it was my understanding that we did this in the English language until somebody actually approached one of the linguistic councils and was like, language should follow the rules of mathematics. Two negatives equal a positive. The English language should not have these double negatives, but in the French language, it's totally permissible to use a double negative. Je ne sais rien, I know nothing. That has ne meaning no and rien meaning nothing. So it is permissible in the French language. Now, does that actually mean that Jack the Ripper was French? Absolutely not. What a lot of people think is that the Goulston Street Graffito was written by someone who didn't speak English well. The word Jews is misspelled, and the word Jews is misspelled, and there's the double negative, so it's grammatically incorrect. So those are just things that indicate that maybe this wasn't written by someone who had a strong command of the English language. And, I think I've said everything I have to say about the Goulston Street Graffito. And also about Robert Donston Stephenson as a Jack the Ripper suspect, someone who, for all intents and purposes, has been eliminated. What do you think about anything that has been discussed in this episode? What do you think about any of the comments that I've made? What do you think about any of the questions and comments that I discussed from you guys? And also, what do you think about the scenarios from the novel I, Ripper? It's a great book. But I don't think it'll bring too much clarity onto how Jack the Ripper wrote the Goulston Street Graffito. Maybe with some of the other points in the book, we'll have some types of genuine windows into the mind of the Whitechapel Fiend, but maybe not from that chapter. And that's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned Dahan, and there is BlackboxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram. And I use TikTok and Instagram to release shorts and reels every Monday through Friday, mostly talking about serial killers, but any subject is fair game, and I will see you over there. Until next time.